This is my pre-IB biology concluding project. The 3 questions attached to this assignment are how is oxygen transported to the cells in your body, what is the difference between active and passive transport across cell membranes, and what is the difference between an autotroph and a heterotroph organism. First, how is oxygen transported to the cells in your body? You first start off with bringing oxygen into your body through the trachea. And the trachea is your windpipe. It's mainly a thin tube composed of little rings called tracheal cartilages. The trachea is connected to the lungs from the larynx, also known as your voice box, which is located at the front of your neck. The trachea divides into bronchi, which are smaller but thicker tubes leading to the left and right lung. There are 3 stages of bronchi. When the trachea first splits into 2 from the carina here, they're called primary bronchi. Then they branch off into secondary bronchi, which are shorter and smaller, and then they branch off into tertiary bronchi. Then they turn into bronchioles, which are smaller tubular extensions to the bronchi, and the ends of them are called terminal bronchi. All these help the trachea connect to the lungs so that oxygen can get to them easily. After the oxygen is led through all of the bronchi and bronchioles, it goes to the alveoli. So alveoli are sacs in the lungs that exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide with the capillary bed surrounding it. They're attached to the terminal bronchioles. This is the trading center. After the oxygen makes it to the alveoli, they're traded with carbon dioxide in the sacs and are picked up by the blood cells in the capillaries. Capillaries are blood vessels located in the alveoli walls, and their function is to give oxygen to the blood cells. The ovals in this diagram represent your blood cells. The blue ones are blood cells depleted of oxygen, and it transitions to red as they get oxygenated. Once your blood is oxygen, it goes through the pulmonary vein and into your heart. Now in the heart, the oxygenated blood goes through the pulmonary veins into the left atrium, then through the mitral valve into the left ventricle, then through the aortic valve into the aorta, and then they will be transporting all the blood cells that are oxygenated all throughout the body. And when the blood cells lose the oxygen and are deoxygenated, they go back through the heart, but this time through the inferior and superior vena cava, into the right atrium. And then they're pumped through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle, and then to the pulmonary valve into the pulmonary artery. And then it gets transported to the alveoli and capillary bed in the lungs to get oxygenated again. What is the difference between active and passive transport across cell membranes? Passive transport is when molecules move with the flow of the concentration gradient through the phospholipid bilayer, also known as the cell membrane. A concentration gradient is when there's a high concentration on one side and a low concentration on the other side. If the concentration of a solution is higher inside the cell than outside of it, then it is hypertonic. But when it's the opposite when the concentration is higher outside a cell than it is inside of it, it is hypotonic. When talking about passive transport, the molecules are moving at a high concentration to a low concentration, so they don't need energy to pass through the cell membrane. This process is called diffusion. Active transport is the opposite. It needs energy to get the job done. The reason why active transport needs energy to work is because it's going from a low concentration to a high concentration. So it's like a hill. If you're going down a hill, it's easy because it doesn't involve much work. You go with the flow. But when you go uphill, it's harder because you're going against gravity instead of with it, so you need energy. There are actually 2 main types of passive transport across the cell membrane. The simplest one is called simple diffusion, or diffusion through the lipid layer, as seen in this picture here. And this is where small nonpolar molecules can go with the concentration gradient through the cell membrane with no problems at all. As an example, oxygen can go through freely because it's a small nonpolar gas molecule. Water then is another example, and diffusion of water is called osmosis. The other type of passive transport is facilitated diffusion, and this is when proteins in the phospholipid layer called transport proteins help bigger molecules go through the cell membrane easily. It's still going from a high concentration to a low concentration, but since they're too big to pass through the cell membrane, they need a tunnel to go through. An example would be glucose, because it's a large molecule that needs a transport protein to get past the membrane. With active transport, we established that we need energy to get from a low concentration to a high concentration. This is where ATP comes in. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. The name explains that we have 3 phosphates in one adenine molecule. When the last phosphate breaks apart from the others, it releases a ton of energy so that the molecules have enough kinetic energy to go against the flow of the concentration gradient. After that, the ATP, now without a phosphate, turns into ADP, which stands for adenosine diphosphate, because it has 2 phosphates now instead of 3. An example that was discussed in class was the sodium-potassium pump seen here. Sodium-potassium pumps are very helpful for cells that need high amounts of energy, like muscles and brain cells. You can see that the ATP here breaks off to power the transport protein to change shape so that the sodium ion can get to the other side, in the highly concentrated side. Now that the transport protein is on the other side, open to the other side, it can help the potassium ion get through the phospholipid layer by releasing the phosphate that powered the channel, which reverts the protein back to how it started, and the potassium ions are on the other side now. In the first circle of this diagram, we can see the green transport protein holding a molecule that wants to be transferred from low concentration outside to the high concentration inside. This is hypertonic, as mentioned before. The adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, inside of the cell will power this transport protein to get the molecule through the cell membrane so that it can do its job on the inside. If we zoom out to where we can see multiple green transport proteins distributed along the cell membrane, then we can see that molecules can easily find one and use it to get to the other side. So, final question. What is the difference between an autotroph and a heterotroph organism? The difference between an autotroph and a heterotroph organism all comes down to where they get their carbon from. Autotrophs, also called producers, make their own food from inorganic substances, while heterotrophs, or consumers, rely on organic material to feed themselves. In the diagram here, the tomato plants are the autotrophs because they use photosynthesis to make their own organic molecules. The goat here is the heterotroph because it's consuming the tomato plant and therefore it consumes the organic molecules from it. Most all plants and algae are autotrophs because they use the process of photosynthesis to turn carbon dioxide and water and sunlight, which are all inorganic substances, into oxygen and sugars like glucose that give the plant energy. Only specific types of plants and algae are heterotrophs and use the outside sources to feed themselves. An example of a heterotrophic plant would be the dodder, as it's a hollow parasitic plant and it infiltrates another plant's stem to get to the vascular bundles in order to sustain itself with the water and nutrients that the host collects, because the dodder doesn't have roots or leaves of its own to collect water and nutrients. It's completely dependent on the consumption of a producer. Almost all animals, on the other hand, are heterotrophs and use organic substances as a food source, though different kind of animals consume different carbon sources. For example, herbivores like rabbits and grasshoppers eat primary producers like grass and leaves. And carnivores like tigers and owls eat consumers like deer and mice. There are also subcategories for autotrophs and heterotrophs. For example, the prefixes photo and chemo refer to how an organism gets its energy source, not carbon source. The Amoeba sisters have a very helpful diagram to visualize it. So a photoautotroph gets its energy from light, and gets its carbon source from inorganic substances. Most plants fit into this photoautotroph category because they use photosynthesis on sunlight and carbon dioxide to turn into food and energy, as stated before. Autotrophs can also get their food from chemicals, though, hence the chemo prefix. Heterotrophs can also have these prefixes. A chemoheterotroph example would be most animals because we get our food and carbon from consuming organic matter. Photoheterotrophs, on the other hand, are really rare because they have to get their carbon from organic materials, but they have to get their energy source from sunlight. That was it. Thank you so much for listening.